Hello everyone and welcome back to another Exo Heroes video, and today we're going to be continuing on our tier list and we're going to be talking specifically about legendary defenders today. So we're not going to waste any time, we're going to get right into it because there's a lot of legendary defenders to cover, and the first one we're going to start at the bottom of our list is Freesia, and I'm going to let Hao get started because he's got a bit to say about her.
Yeah, so as you would expect, we have Freesia at the bottom of this list. And when I was looking at the game earlier, when we were formulating this tier list, I saw people give her 4.6 community score. And I just can't really bring myself to understand exactly what's going on here. And here are some of my reasons why I don't really think she brings all that much. Because first of all, her A1, I think it's probably one of the worst skill to have on a defender. Because what you do is it grants damage reflection to all back row allies for 12 turns. It only costs 1 mana, okay, but the biggest issue is when you have a defender, what you want her to do in that case is either be able to lock down the enemy through CCs, or being able to provide utility and keep your backline alive. But reflect damage doesn't really do that. The only thing it does is it kind of returns some of the damage that your back row takes back to the enemy. But that's not really the key here. The one thing that you really want to do is to be able to keep the back row alive, and it doesn't do that. So sure, if your back row dies, you're gonna return a decent amount of damage, but at the end of the day, that's not a goal here. Her A2 then brings a little bit of single target damage at 300%, not very high for a defender, and then also brings CC for 6 turns. It's okay, but it costs 4 mana, so it's relatively high mana cost. And lastly, we just want to touch on her passive, Thrust 2, and there are 3 passives among the defenders, and in our opinion, when we look at Thrust 2, the biggest issue we have with this one specifically is the fact that it's not really useful. The enemy team is not going to focus you down. And a lot of times with defenders, the enemy team are just going to bypass you unless you have a way to taunt the enemy team to force them to attack you, but Freesia doesn't have that. So the Thrust 2 on her is going to bring very little value until maybe the end of the fight when the enemy finally decides to shift their attention to you. So can be relatively useful in PvE situations, but definitely has very minimal impact in PvP situations. But with that being said, let's move on to our number 13 on the list.
Right, so that's gonna be Pitbull, and as you can see here, his A1 is Burst Break, requires 1 mana, deals 96% damage to all back row enemies. And part of the issue here, and Hao touched on this a little bit with Freesia, and we're going to see this with the other heroes at the bottom of the list as well, is they do damage, but not enough. Right? It's not enough damage to really justify oh my god, they're a threat, I need to take care of them, because defenders don't have that high attack base to begin with, and this is just 96% of that to all back row enemies. And of course this is again dependent on how the enemy composition is. If they're back row heavy, it works. If they're not, then it's not very effective. Then we have his A2 Explosive Swing, 3 mana, deals 210% damage to 1 enemy, so it's a single target ability, and afflicts a target with Confuse for 5 turns. And I believe he's the only defender in this tier list that afflicts the target with Confuse. So that's a little bit of a niche there. Ultimately, it's not a very useful niche. Again, this is something that we talked about a little bit earlier with Freesia. You need to have, as a defender, some way to force the enemy to attack you, or else they're just going to ignore you. And looking at this Explosive Swing, it's a single target ability with Confuse for 5 turns. And honestly, for 5 turns, it might not be the enemy's turn who's confused to attack you. So essentially that debuff just wears out way too quick. And to talk about our number 12, 11, and 13, we're going to kind of group them all together a little bit, and I'm going to let Hao talk about those and go over their similarities.
Yeah, so for the next 3, they're really kind of all under the same archetype. And these heroes are going to be, at number 12 is Nika, number 11 is Spica, and then at number 10 is Lyungen. And essentially what they do is, they're very similar in terms of what their kit brings. All 3 of them has Thrust 2 passive, so as we mentioned before, unless you have a way to force the opponents to attack you, this passive is not going to really bring a lot of value, because most of the time they're just going to ignore you for as long as they can. And all 3 of them also brings with their A1 a single target CC. And this is kind of where we think they bring the most value, is this CC, but again, all 3 of them bring single target CC. which is why we have them relatively low on the list, because obviously the value of that is not as good as if they can bring AoE CC. And lastly, all three of them has kind of a damage dealing A2 that doesn't bring any utility. So for Nika in this case, it's an AoE damage at 4 mana cost and does 204% damage to all enemies. And this is one of the reasons why we put her at the bottom of the three, because when you have AoE damage and it's spread out, the impact of that is just not going to be as much. Where if we look at Spica here, her A2 does 600% damage, also at 4 mana cost, but to a single target. So the opponent will feel the impact of this skill a lot more, as you will be able to single out a specific target and potentially take them out with the damage that you bring. So it's going to be a little bit more impactful, and it allows you to strategically take out the opponent a little bit better here. And lastly, we have Lyungen in number 10, slightly above Spica and Nika. And his A2 is very similar at 240% damage to back row, so again, a little bit more spread out, not as impactful in our opinion as Spica's. But what brings him to a slightly higher ranking than Spica is the fact that he does have a fate core that offers a little bit more survivability through the Barrier of Will passive. So overall, we think all three of them just doesn't green too much, right? The Thrust 2 passive, not really ideal when you don't have a way to provoke. A1 is single target CC, it's okay, but not as good as obviously anyone that has AoE CC, and A2 that's just not very meaningful when it comes to damage. Maybe Spica's A2 is probably the best of the three, but still overall feels less meaningful. But with that being said, let's move on to our number 9, which is going to be Litchenstein.
Sure, so Lichtenstein is in a bit of a weird niche here, in that he kind of stands out among the legendary defenders and doesn't fit into any of the other existing archetypes. So if we take a look at his A1 here, Knight's Oath, it's a barrier for 58% of his own maximum health to himself for 11 turns. And to me, this just doesn't seem very defendery. It's very selfish, right? He's giving himself a barrier, 58% of his own max health is quite a chunky amount, and 11 turns is, a long time to have this shield. My issue is that it's just for him. Like, he can't even have the option to give it to somebody else. It's always going to be on him. So then, does it really matter if he has more survivability? And the answer is in his A2, Subjugating Holy Sword. It's a single target ability, 420% damage to one enemy, and a stun for 7 turns. So even though he has a lot of survivability from his 2 mana cost A1, what's the point of him living so long if he doesn't really do that much damage, and he's only going to stun one person? 7 turns is a long time, but again, as we've mentioned so many times before, AoE CC is just so much more effective. And the other problem is that this costs 5 mana, which means even if he does stay alive, it's going to take him a long time. He'll have to take a lot of hits, he'll have to attack a lot, and go through a lot of turns in order to even use this ability once.
Yeah, and I would just like to add to that just a little bit, is kind of bringing back to this Knight's Oath A1. Right? It's like you mentioned, it does bring him a little bit more sustainability, a little bit more survivability. And I think that could work if he has a way to force the opponent to attack him. But unlike some of the other defenders we'll see later on, he has the Protect 2 passive, which on the surface is great because it does share health with lowest health target. But I think it would be better if he has Block 2, where he can actually force the opponents to attack him through a provoke, and utilize the Knight's Oath shielding a little bit better. But in this case, he has Protect 2, and the synergy between that as well as Knight's Oath just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Right, I mean, I totally agree in that in a 5-man roster, they could just ignore Lichtenstein after he uses his A2. So, I mean, that's a great point. And as we move on to our next hero in the list, which is number 8, Guder, I just want to make a quick mention here. If we look back at all the other heroes we've covered already, many of them have the Thrust passive.
Right.
And that was one of our key factors in deciding that they belong lower on the list, because we mentioned Thrust just doesn't do much. There's not much utility there, and it's hard to get off because enemies can just avoid attacking you without a provoke. Now, Guder has something a little bit special that the other heroes don't have, and I'll let Hao talk about that.
Yeah. So as we mentioned before, Thrust 2, people can just bypass you if they choose to. I think Guder, among all the heroes that has Thrust 2, perhaps is the only one that can actually utilize this to a certain extent. And that's mostly in his A2. So he has a 5 mana cost A2 that's relatively expensive, but it does 840% damage to a single target. And I think this alone will make some opponents potentially think twice about leaving him alone, where he can then potentially come in and have the ability to take out one of the opponent's key damage dealers. So the fact that he has such high damage dealing A2 kind of in a way works as an indirect provoke where people will think twice about not attacking him. And in that sense, he can utilize the thrust 2 a little bit better than some of the other ones we mentioned, such as Lyungen or Spica. And also he, with his A1, brings a little bit of CC. It's only 1 mana cost, so relatively efficient, and has the Confuse with 3 turns. Relatively short duration, so you have to be really strategic on who you use this attack on, but nonetheless brings a little bit of CC and has a little bit of value there. So overall, we think he's kind of middle of the road type of defender. Definitely a cut above some of the earlier ones we mentioned up until now, but not as good as the ones we'll be looking at from here on out. But with that being said, let's move on to the next 3. And with these 3, we're essentially moving to kind of an upper tier of the defenders here.
Right, so you mentioned an upper tier of defender, and I want to clarify that one of the reasons for this increase in tier is again mainly because of the passive, right? As we move up, you'll start to notice we're moving away from the Thrust 2 passive into Protect 2, which grants share health to the ally with the lowest health. So here, this is the archetype we're talking about. This is the true defender that really helps the team survive. And that comes through in Hawkeye's kit as well. If you look at her A1 here, Piercing Light. So this is a 1 mana ability. It deals 120% damage to one enemy with a stun for 3 turns. So it's a short stun for sure, but it's also a 1 mana ability, which means it's very spammable. And this is just really annoying because you can see on the bottom of your screen when enemies' turns are coming up. So you can kind of prepare for this as long as it's your turn to attack. Now looking at her A2, Lightning Impact, this ability deals 420% damage to one enemy, but it only costs 3 mana, which makes it pretty mana efficient in terms of damage percentage. And again, Defender's base attack is not that high, but considering how low cost this is, it's still relatively spammable as long as you don't have a priority target to CC. And just this whole kit, along with her Protect 2, makes her a reasonable damage threat with a little bit of CC, a little bit of health sharing with her team. So she still has a good balance of damage and utility, but not enough to move her up further into this list.
Right, and I think that's exactly the case. So if now we look at number 6, Alexei here, I think that's exactly what Alexei brings, is that additional bit of utility versus Hawkeye. So very similar to Hawkeye, he also has the Protect 2 passive, allows him to provide shared health with the ally with lowest HP, so that's pretty good. And then his A1 now is 1 mana cost, that's 240% damage, so relatively spammable single target damage skill. It's okay, and it offers a little bit of utility when you need to finish someone off. But his value really comes through in his A2, and also what puts him ahead of Hawkeye is instead of having a single target CC, with his A2, Alexei brings an AoE CC to the entire back row of the opponent's team. And that is pretty substantial because you can really lock down a lot of the backline threat of the opponent's team with this skill. And also the CC lasts 6 turns rather than 3 turns. Sure, the mana cost is a little bit higher at 4, but overall the fact that it's AoE, the fact that it lasts 6 turns, just brings a little bit more utility to your team, and overall place him just a hair above Hawkeye at number 6. And now let's take a look at number 5, Griesel.
Right, so I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce her name. I'm just going to go with Griesel. Maybe let's go with Griesel. But she also shares the Protect 2 passive, which we've already gone over, right? And I think that she is a very stereotypical defender, which I love because it's very consistent, right? We look at her first skill here, Blessing of Blue Deer, which is such a cool skill name. Back row first, grants a barrier of 18% of her own max health to all back row allies for 10 turns. 10 turns is a long time, and 18% of a defender's base HP is also very high. Most importantly, it costs 1 mana. So when we think about this in comparison to our worst legendary defender, in our opinion, Freesia, right? What does Freesia do? She reflects damage from the back row, but she doesn't keep the back row alive. What does Griesel do? She keeps the back row alive, consistently spamming these shields out, and then this is just so much more useful. Then her A2, Grassland Hunting, 4 mana, a little bit pricier, but this deals 300% damage to one enemy. But the damage is not what's important here, it's the status effect, which afflicts the target with blind for 6 turns. And actually, we stumbled upon a Reddit thread a little bit ago that mentioned, it was talking about debuffs, and we'll shout it out and give it a link in the description so you guys can take a look at it. But the thread says that Griesel is the only hero besides the Banga family fatecores that can blind enemies. And so this is so important because blind is actually, I think, a pretty underrated debuff. And the fact that, she's one of the rare heroes that can utilize that, I think gives her a niche that puts her a little bit above, which is why, she's higher up on this list here.
Also, I really just like the way she looks as a character design. I think
you do.
She's very unique, and every time I look at her, she just reminds me of Princess Mononoke.
Right, the Miyazaki.
The Miyazaki movie. So that's just, doesn't put her higher on our ranking, but...
So, talking about who's higher up on the ranking, we have Luke. And Luke is a really interesting hero. I'm going to let Hao talk about him a little bit and go into what makes him so great.
Yeah. With Luke, we're really moving into kind of the upper echelon of the defenders. At number 4, Luke comes in with a block passive. And this is, again, a little bit different from the ones we mentioned. He's the first hero on our tier list so far that has a block 2, which is really, really good because it brings in AoE Provoke, and it procs automatically whenever one of your hero drops below 30% HP. And it lasts 10 turns on the entire enemy team, so it's really, really nice. But sometimes the issue with block is it can put your specific defender under a lot of enemy fire. But worry not with Luke, because his A2 actually brings a little bit of survivability to him as well. What it does is at 4 mana cost, sure, it's a little bit pricey, but it does give him 53% increased maximum health for 9 turns. So that's a massive amount of health increase. And at the same time, he also does share health with all allies for 18 turns. So essentially, when you think about this skill, it's pretty much just the Protect 2 passive. So Luke, in our opinion, is one of those unique heroes that has 2 passives. He has the Block 2, naturally comes with it, and his Shield of Loyalty A2 essentially allows him to also have the Protect 2 passive. Just very unique hero, and does a lot of different things within his kit. And that's not to say he also has his A1, which is Burning Hammer, and it also provides a little bit of a single target provoke for 4 turns. So his entire kit is really all about provoking the enemy, but at the same time giving himself buffs to survive those attacks a little bit better and still do a little bit of share health and protect your backline a little bit better. It's just a very unique hero. Not to say that he also has a Banga Fate Core that adds a little bit of added value to him. So overall, a very, very solid defender. And if you don't have some of the top tier Fated defenders, give a Luke a chance. He might surprise you. But with that being said, let's shift our focus to our number 3 on the list, which is Firis.
Right, so Firis comes in here at number 3. She's got the Protect 2 passive, so share health with an ally with the lowest max health. And we've already gone over that, that's pretty basic. Now, her A1 Holy Light Strike, 1 mana, deals 48% damage to all back row enemies, very low. But that's not what we care about. We care about the fact that it afflicts the targets with stun for 3 turns. And this is so important because it makes her sort of like Alexei, in that Alexei has Frost for 6 turns on the backline. But the thing is, this costs 1 mana. It's super spammable, and against a backline heavy team or a team with very significant backline threats, this is just going to be so annoying for them, and their main damage dealers are just going to be able to move like maybe a third of the time. So this is actually, while it seems underwhelming at first if you look at the numbers, it's got a lot of hidden value. Then you look at her A2 Condemnation, it deals 210% single target damage, and it has a status effect that stuns for 5 turns. And the reason that we put Firis up in number 3, and some of the things that you'll see are consistent with the top 2, as well as Luke, who is number 4, is they have AoE CC. They have a ton of CC. And this is, again, it's something that's consistent. It's something that I believe defenders should have, because that's what makes them a threat, right? Like, why would someone attack you if you don't do damage, which defenders typically aren't going to do, exception Gooter, and if they don't have CC, they just ignore you. But here, as we move up in the list, we just think that the utility is worth so much more. And as we talk about number 2 and number 1 following, you'll start to notice a trend here.
And with number 2 and number 1 now, we're really kind of going into the very, very...
cream of the crop.
Yeah, exactly, right? Top of the iceberg. So, and that's going to be Degas and Tantalo. And I'll focus on Degas and I'll let Edward to touch on Tantalo a little bit. And I really think with Degas and Tantalo, we're getting to the point where these are almost kind of your quasi-fated defenders,
right,
essentially, right? Like, they're very, very good with just their base kit. So let's take a look at Degas. As we mentioned, Degas comes with Block 2, which in our opinion is really the best of the 3 defender passives out there. Block 2 does AoE provoke whenever one of your heroes falls below 30% HP, and the impact of that is immediate. The impact of that also very consistent, as it lasts 10 turns. So even though defenders tend to have relatively lower speed, this does not have to proc on their turn, so it's really useful. And also, Degas comes with the Dragon Knight Blessing passive, so has a little bit of additional utility out there for your Dragon's team. And his A1 is a very good skill, so what he does is, at 3 mana cost, it increases his own maximum health by 37% for 8 turns, and allows him to share health for the rest of your team. So very similar to Luke's A2, but unlike Luke's A2, it doesn't grant him as much health, but it does allow him to use this skill at a relatively lower mana cost of 3. So it's a little bit more consistent, even though the impact is a little bit less. Similarly, his Cursed Trident A2 allows him to do AoE damage to the entire team, so not just the backline, the entire team, and allow him to apply freeze for 5 turns. So again, like Edward just mentioned, we really value defenders that can bring AoE CCs to lock down the enemy team, to be that disruptor that you desperately need, so that your back row can do what they have to do uninterrupted. And Degas A2 does exactly that. The only thing we want to point out is it does require 5 mana, so that's relatively high, but given that Degas is a Frost hero and has pretty high block rate himself, so he's going to be able to generate mana pretty consistently, so the 5 mana cost might not be as damaging as you might imagine. And lastly, we would just want to point out, he does have a Summer Festa Fatecore, even though we don't think Summer Festa Fatecore offers too much, but still the Summer's Blessing passive offers a little bit of utility whenever you're up against an enemy team that has a lot of frost damage, someone that runs Battery in their backline. It does provide a little bit of utility there. He's not going to take advantage of the flop passive all that much, but it's okay. So overall, we put Degas at number 2, and we really think, unless you have the likes of Wulom or Garth or Shufraken, Degas is probably one of the better choices when it comes to defenders.
And now moving on to number 1 on our list of legendary defenders, we have Tantalo. And really, this shouldn't come as a surprise to most people, right? Tantalo's pretty generally accepted as a very good defender. Like Degas and our other top tier heroes, he does have block 2. We just think that the AoE CC is so valuable, as we've mentioned before, so we're not going to get too far into detail with that again. His A1, Ground Flip, 3 mana, is a decent cost, 71% damage to all enemies. So if you could use this against, 5 enemies, a full team, this would be okay. Otherwise, the damage is going to be a little bit lackluster. Again, it's not about the damage, it's about the CC, the AoE CC in this case, which is a provoke for 3 turns. So not only does he have AoE provoke on his block 2 passive, but he has AoE provoke on his A1 as well, which is just so incredibly annoying to have to deal with, especially if you can get someone to sustain him and keep him alive. Then his A2 is body check, 4 mana, so a little bit more. This does 300% damage to one enemy and afflicts the target with paralyze for 6 turns. Again, this just highlights what sets Tantalo apart from the bottom tier of our list and why he's number 1. His abilities all do damage, he's got a mix of single target and AoE, and he's got CC in every part of his kit. His passive is AoE CC, his A1 is AoE CC, his A2 is single target CC for 6 turns, right? So when you have a hero that has spammable CC like this, it makes them so much more annoying to deal with, especially in PvP situations. Because if you think about this holistically, right, we've talked about a lot of these heroes in a vacuum, but in an actual combat situation, you might come up against let's say, a Kaya, or an Anastasia, or a Talia, right? A healer or a support hero that has a lot of cleanses, that has a lot of remove debuffs, things like that in their kit. And so if you have a hero like Alexei, let's say, or Litchenstein, who have relatively high mana cost abilities that are like single target CC, then the next turn, Talia cleansed it, Kaya cleansed it. And now you have to wait, a number of turns just to get that mana back to use the ability again. But when you have somebody with consistent CC that they could use over and over again like this, it makes life much more difficult for the enemy team, and it sort of invalidates a lot of the support utility that they have. And so we think that just that perfect mix of damage and CC is what puts Tantalo at the top. And so all of that is just encompassing the base Tantalo. If we move beyond that and talk about his FC, which we pulled him just this morning. It was very recent. So we're very aware of how it works, but now he's got a couple of changes. Number one, his A1, now instead of having that AoE provoke, it is AoE, but it does damage over time. It poisons the enemies for 44% damage every turn for 3 turns, and it also comes with 2 buffs that increase the attack of allies by 13% of his attack for 9 turns, and increases the block of all allies by 42 for 18 turns when the skill hits. So let's move on to his A2. The names are the same. Body check, requires 3 mana, deals 262% damage to one enemy, poisons the target for 92% damage every turn for 4 turns, and decreases target attack by 35% of his own attack for 8 turns. So this is a mouthful, but really that's not what's important. The important part about FC Tantalo, and what makes him one of the better Banga family FCs, is the fact that all of the Banga family FCs have Heart Strike, which the passive is very difficult to talk about, but essentially, whenever you deal damage to the enemy who has the Heart Strike mark, you level it up. And at level 3, they're basically going to die within that turn or the next turn. So it's essentially a ticking time bomb of a passive and is very, very strong. Now, many of the Banga family FC do not have reliable damage over time to proc this consistently. They have to wait their turn and then do a single target attack again. But Tantalo has poison on both of his abilities, so each tick of that poison is going to increase the level of Heart Strike and just make him much faster at proccing it than the other FC units.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree. Tantalo, whether it's a Fate Core or just the base Tantalo, definitely brings a lot of value to your team. So, like we said, if you don't have someone like Garv, someone like Wulum, Tantalo's probably going to be one of the best choices you can possibly bring for your defender slot if you need one. But with that being said, that's our tier list for legendary defenders. As we mentioned before, on the bottom of the list, we typically see these heroes with Thrust 2 passive that doesn't bring quite enough utility to your team and also doesn't bring quite enough CC either. And then we have in the middle of the pack, Griesel, Alexei, Hawkeye, that are more of your stereotypical defender that does a little bit of everything, but just not enough. And then at the top of the list, we have Luke, Firis, Degas, and eventually Tantalo, who in our opinion are just almost to the same level of a fated defender, and definitely better than Shotgun if you're wondering. But with that being said, that's our tier list. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, hopefully you guys find it informative. As always, if you're interested in other Exos Hero related content, feel free to check out our other videos, where we'll be focusing on reviewing legendary heroes over the course of next couple of weeks, so stay tuned if you're interested in those. And lastly, if you enjoyed today's video, please leave a like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video soon.
Peace.